So let's get started up again. So we have a little panel discussion now. Part of the idea, we had some great presentations on cybersecurity risk and challenges, and I talked earlier about AAA risk, that idea of accidents, attacks, and acts of nature. Well, one of the things that we wanted to talk about was a little bit about the commercial sector and some of the larger trends that we're seeing in the commercial sector. There have been discussions about commercial influences on a lot of cybersecurity decisions, et cetera, but we wanted to talk with a few folks who have some other experiences in the larger commercial sector, seeing some trends on what's going on in markets in terms of risks and solutions. So today we're going to be talking with Peter Graham, who's a consultant in the technology area focusing on the mobile markets and formerly with Verizon, and then Don Thibault, who's the director of Open Identity Exchange and also the Open ID Foundation, among other engagements. And they're going to offer their thoughts on the commercial perspectives on some risks and some solution structures that may start to address and link up with some of the discussions that were raised in some of the papers. We talk about the commercial sector as if it's an isolated sector, but a lot of the builds that are done for government parties are done in commerce. The governments don't build their own trucks and develop their own software, et cetera. And also, part of the profile of these security solutions are looking at economic incentives and penalties that are part of the enforcement regimes for these things. So if you want people to act in ways that are consistent across large populations, there has to be some type of engagement, some kind of system to do that. Because we had one of the earlier discussions, an excellent discussion on the different nation-state responses and how different nations are treating these issues. Well, the challenge with the nation-state in a lot of this is that it's not big enough to cover a lot of these questions because they're trans-jurisdictional questions. So one of the things we'll talk about in the discussion we'll have after the first couple of presentations is just what does neighborhood watch look like cross-jurisdictionally? And so if you think about it, I made the comment earlier that there's stock exchanges in Tokyo, New York, and London, but they're knit together with contracts. Well, what might the role of contracts be here for starting to establish some markets? And what are the kind of market mechanisms might be present to start to elicit that neighborhood watch? Because the idea of markets are places where people engage in self-interested behavior, but it results in selfless behavior. So for instance, people on the oil commodities exchange don't love each other. They don't go there because they're having a party. They go there because it's a lower risk zone for them to engage in their self-interested transactions involving oil futures, for instance. So similarly, what might some of those mechanisms be that might start to be deployed in this data space that's now emerging, and these risk spaces that are emerging? So Peter, why don't you start off with your slides first, starts. Thanks, and I'll give you this.
Yeah, that's fine. So it's really good to have been here all day long and have watched all of these other presentations because it sort of informs, I think, what we're going to do and changes it just a little bit. But we're primarily going to be talking about identity. And I'm going to define what I mean by identity because it's not maybe what that term changes. It's evolving. It's constantly evolving. So I'm going to define what I mean by it in a minute. But before I do, because we are recording this and because we have so many lawyers in the room, I also have to say that the thoughts and opinions that I'm going to express here are absolutely that of my employer. There you go. That's because the P and the G up there is me. I can't tell you who the S is because that's a secret. But before I actually get into this, though, the reason why I do that is because I want to tell you kind of where I'm coming from if you don't know who this is, because if you are now rushing to your laptop to go look up my website, it's not there yet. That's how new this company is. But I've spent the last 6 years or so working for Verizon, as Scott mentioned. And during that time, I was fortunate enough to sit on the board of directors for Verizon for the Open Identity Exchange, the Open ID Foundation. I was fortunate to work with the World Economic Forum on rethinking personal data, especially in emerging markets. I worked in the product team. I've got a couple of patents with Verizon. So I don't tell you all of those things to establish my credentials necessarily, but a lot of what I'm going to be saying here might be a little controversial. But I want you to know where it's coming from. And it's coming from the fact that for the last 6, 7 years, I've been traveling all over the globe talking to largely the Fortune 100 governments about this thing of identity and why don't we have internet scale identity and what is it going to take to have that, right? And that's where the economics of this comes in. So that kind of gives you a grounding. I'm going to talk for about 10 minutes or so, then I'm going to turn it over to Don. And I apologize in advance. We both have a hard stop at 4, which I regret. I would love to be here longer to speak with all of you. But if you want to reach out to either one of us outside of this forum, Scott knows how to find us. So this is sort of what we're going to talk about. This is sort of the foundation of what we're going to talk about relevant to identity. But let me describe what I mean by that and what I mean by internet scale identity. Because internet scale identity doesn't exist, right? And I'll also say that there's no such thing as an identity provider, although our esteemed colleague from Microsoft might tell me he disagrees. But there really isn't any such thing as an identity provider today. You've got Google, you've got Microsoft, you've got Twitter, right? You can use some of those social logins at various different websites, but the motivation behind those providers is quite different than what we're going to see in the next 5 years, although Microsoft is actually making progress in this area. But when I say internet scale identity, what I'm really talking about is the best analogy I can give you is think of your credit card, right? Your Visa. If all you have is one single credit card, you've got that one Visa, you can use that all over the world, anywhere. You can go to Tokyo, you can get a hotel, you can buy things online, you can use it anywhere. And that's because basically Visa is nothing more than a trust framework. It's not quite a one-to-one analogy, but everybody understands the rules. Everybody understands who's getting paid, when they're getting paid, what are the rules relevant for a merchant, for card present, card not present transactions, right? I understand as a consumer that if I use my Marriott Visa, I'm going to get points at the courtyard, right? I understand what the interest rates are. We all understand what the rules are. Of course, it took 100 years to get there, right? Well, we don't have that in identity. That doesn't exist. And that's what I mean by internet scale identity. When I was at Verizon, the reason why we participated with groups like the Open Identity Exchange, the Open ID Foundation, is to try to create that market. Right? Because when you work for entities that are that large, if you don't have a large playing field with which to go compete, you don't really have a business. So that's what I mean by internet scale identity and the fact that it doesn't exist. So here you go. If you're tired and you want to go get a cup of coffee, this is it. I'm all about pragmatics. So when Scott earlier was talking about the BLT, you've got legal, you've got engineers, we have academians, right? Researchers. That's not me. I'm pure on the business, right? So I've spent my time building identity products and then trying to sell them, okay? And so there's some things that I've learned in trying to do that, okay? And I'm going to just sort of look at these 3 entities. There's more, but I think for such a limited conversation, we'll deal with these 3. Is you got to follow the money, and everybody's got to get paid. So what do I mean by that? Well, first of all, enterprises don't get paid the way you think they do, or they don't have the same concerns that you might think that they do in the identity space. And so what I'm going to say is enterprises do not care about security. Let that sink in for a second, okay? They don't care. They care about something, but it's not security. Why is that? They care a little bit about brand erosion, right? But remember the Target breach last year, right? I keep waiting for the motherlode of a breach that's going to create a change in this business, but it hasn't happened. People are shopping at Target again. Right? That breach cost them about $250 million, right? That's not even 1 quarter's worth of operating profit. They don't care. It's a drop in the bucket. So people came back. So the brand came back, right? Fraud, right? I was trying to sell an identity widget, and I was in front of a C-level, the Fortune 50 company. I don't want to say the name because I own my own company, but my legal team's a lot smaller than theirs, so I don't want to have that conversation. But in front of a C-level executive talking about fraud reduction, and I've got this great widget, spent an hour talking about this great widget, and it was going to reduce fraud, and I proved it. I had the numbers. I knew I had the product that he needed. And when I finished, he said, okay, what else? I don't care. Fraud is built into our operating model. I don't care, okay? That's already paid for. How do you increase my ARPU, average revenue per user per year, right? That's what they care about. How do we make money off of your identity widget? They don't care about fraud, right? People, that's the second group in this equation. People have a value. We've talked about this. We have values associated with our identity, right? I'm going to say another thing that maybe is going to sound like it's not real, but my experience tells me that people actually don't really care about privacy. They care about consent, they care about control. They don't care about privacy. I mean, none of us every one of us knows that we are the product that Google sells. We are the product that Facebook sells. We all know that, right? And we say that we don't like that, but yet we still do it. And we say we don't like spam, but when Christmas rolls around, or I even say, become a little granular than that, if I'm in the mood, if I'm in the market for a couple of suits, for example, and all of a sudden that ad shows up for a discount of 2-for-1 at Brooks Brothers, yeah, I want that. That's me selling my identity, getting value for my identity. So it's not really privacy we're after. The problem with the privacy, the way it works today, is that it's all or nothing. Right? We get consent for everything in order to use the product of the service. Now, for Facebook, maybe that makes sense. For Google, maybe that makes sense, right? But does it make sense for Best Buy? Probably not, but we still do it. All right, so that's the other component, I think. And then the providers. So the identity providers today that would truly be sort of cross-domain and global really are just the socials. You've got Facebook, you've got Google. You can use your Twitter credentials to log into various places. But their monetization model is quite different than what I think we're going to see starting to emerge. So identity providers somehow have to get paid. And the reality is today, there is no authentication market. I mean, there's a market to sell widgets, but go try to sell somebody on identity that you're going to have a per user per year fee and I'm going to make your user safe. There's no market for that. There really isn't, for these reasons that we were just talking about. All right, so what do they care about? Okay, in a nutshell, both consumers and enterprises only care about one thing, and that's reduce friction. That's it, right? How do I get from a visit to a sale? That's it. That's what enterprises care about. And every single click that I introduce into that chain results in an abandoned basket. There's math. So every single click that, for example, when you're on Amazon, every single click is analyzed endlessly because of that, right? But then we as consumers, we wouldn't be abandoning those baskets if we weren't forced to go through these onerous processes by which we register for services and then consume those services. So that's really it. What we're all looking for, enterprises and consumers, is reduced friction. And so the products that we put into the marketplace, that we build from an identity perspective, have to do that. They have to be invisible. They have to be intangible. That is, they don't interfere with the process of a transaction, right? They have to do those things, but they also have to be somewhat safe. And when I say somewhat, I'll define what I mean by that. And so the thread that I've been tearing on for the last year or so is this idea of attributes, and mobile specifically. And what do I mean by that? And how does that work? So if you look at sort of the legacy attribute market and the way that's, there's really been sort of two primary buckets. There are what we call hard attributes, which are attributes that are fully vetted, right? There's an identity proving event associated with that attribute. So think of LexisNexis, think of Experian, think of Equifax, right? And they've got information about you, like your address, that they have verified. It's a strongly verified attribute, right? And those have primarily been used in transactional type events, meaning that I'm applying for a credit card or I'm doing something where there's some money involved. Take a look at that attribute and make a decision, right, based on some secret sauce. The other type of attributes are what we call soft attributes, right? And those are, think inferred or self-certified, meaning that I just get into a website and I say, my name is Peter Graham. Well, okay, nobody checked. I could be a dog, I could be a parrot, for anybody knows, right? Or an inferred attribute that also isn't necessarily going to be verified, meaning location is an inferred attribute, right? Behavior is inferred. Those are inferred attributes. Those are important, right? And typically those have been used in commerce applications, right? Right? This is what Facebook, and that's their business models. They use that data, that inferred data, that self-asserted data to make decisions about the things that they market to us. They put us in buckets of demographics and then they sell things to us. That's changing. Okay, it's changing. If you think about, for example, Facebook, you think about Google, you think about Twitter, you're going to start seeing those social logins more, and this is not me saying this, is Gartner saying this, you're going to see that more and more often being used in enterprise situations where security actually does matter. And they're going to use things that don't get in the way, meaning They're going to do things like social scraping, or they're already doing this. Social scraping, that is looking at your social activity, making decisions about who you are and your behavior and where you might be, right? And then making an assertion on your behalf that is higher than, say, a NIST. If everybody's here familiar with NIST, the standard that they use is 800-63, a NIST level 1. So something that's a little higher. So it's a little better than a 1, maybe not as good as a 2, but it's good enough. And that's kind of a key concept that I want to get across. What we need to be delivering are products in this business that are better. They're faster, they change, and they're not, so they're not, we don't want to let the perfect be the enemy of the pragmatic. And a use case I could give you, and this is a real one. So I was having dinner with a colleague of mine who owns identity for one of the largest email providers in the world, so you can just guess who that might be. And this couple of years ago, and he was saying, look, we're losing a couple of million email accounts a month. This is a big problem for us, right? And in some cases, we can't even give them back. He actually told me a story about a doctoral candidate who lost their dissertation because it was on Google Docs and there was no backup for it, and they couldn't get this person their account back. Now, I'm not going to make any judgments about the fact that a doctoral candidate didn't have a backup of their dissertation, but having said that, right, what they found was that everybody understands what multi-factor authentication is, I assume, right? That even when they offered that multi-factor authentication to those people, they might turn it on for a month and then they would turn it right back off. So they had to find different ways to keep people secure that was good enough. So for example, if I use my credit card or I log into my email account from London, and that's not a normal thing for me, maybe, right? Well, if I do a social scrape of your Facebook and I see that you've been talking about, staying at the Marriott County Hall in London, and you're going to go see the, this and that and the other, and then I see that login is from the Marriott County Hall, probably you. I can probably make a good enough guess that that's you, and I can probably get away with it without interfering with you. That's what I'm talking about, reduction in friction, and that's what I'm talking about where you can see soft attributes showing up more and more and more in situations where higher security is required. And then you're also going to see, I think, MNOs, banks, okay? In my opinion, there are really 4 entities that are going to emerge as the identity providers in the emerging ecosystem. Those are governments, telcos, financials, and socials, right? If you think about financials and socials, financials and MNOs, they have a couple of things in common. Right? They strongly verify their customers. So think about what it takes to establish cell phone service, right? That's kind of usually 2 different types of ID, in-person ID proving event. So they're pretty sure that, the attributes they have are strongly verified attributes on who I am. Well, they'd like to monetize that. We've been hearing for the last 5 years that data is the new oil. Right? But nobody knows how to mine it yet, and that's a difficult conversation to have. And I can tell you that from experience, because when you walk into an executive at a place like Verizon or AT&T, and you try to convince that executive that you've got this idea about identity and we should be using our customers' data for that, and could be a lucrative business, and that same executive knows that if they put up a tower down the street, that translates into real math for my quarterly revenue. It's kind of a hard conversation to have. And oh, by the way, if we get it wrong, we might take a 10% hit for the next 3 months as customers flee before we get them back. So it's still taking a while, but I think, and I'm going to leave Don, I don't want to step on his thunder here, because I think he's going to talk about some of the things the MNOs are doing right now relevant to identity when we get there. I'm not going to actually go into a use case because we don't have time for that. All right, so actually we're here. So why MNOs? And then I'll turn it over to my colleague Don Tabot. So why MNOs? Because of the reasons that I just said. Why should mobile operators be in this business? One, they've solved this problem before. When you think about identity the way it exists today, it's very much like that financial example that I gave you. It's very much like me going down to the bread maker and establishing credit with the bread maker, like it was 100 years ago. That's where we are with identity, because I do that with Best Buy. I've got 60 accounts, just like all of you have, in a spreadsheet somewhere, and I'm probably using all the same, and you're probably all using all the same passwords, more or less, for all of them, just like I am. Let's just be honest about that. Most of us, that's what we do, okay? But MNOs have solved this problem. If you think about the evolution of the telecommunications company, it started with what, right? Right? It started with a point-to-point communication system with the telegraph. You know, I have a little device, I have 100 miles of cable, I have another device. Well, obviously that didn't scale, right? The other thing that MNOs have is they have, because of their the agreements and the frameworks that they have in place relevant to how communications work. I can pick up a phone right here and call Tokyo if I want to, and it's just going to work. I don't have to know how it's going to work, it's just going to. They have deep relationships within the business communities where they operate. Right? And so they have a natural distribution system. So I think that's another reason why you're going to be seeing this. And they've got that global infrastructure. Verizon, I forget the exact number, but owns most of the world's IP-based infrastructure, right? One last thing I'll say about Verizon, not that I'm here to plug them, I don't work for them anymore, but has anybody here ever heard of by raising hand, the Verizon's Data Breach Investigative Report? A few of you? I highly recommend you go take a look at it. It's free. It's free and it's fantastic. And it analyzes breaches. There are 30 different organizations that participate in this yearly report that include the United States Secret Service, cyber authorities from the Netherlands, from the UK, I believe Japan maybe. But one of the things, the stats that I would always pull out of there while I was there is how much of the data breach activity is a result of lost, stolen, or weak credentials. And the number is typically a little higher than 70%. So this is actually a big problem that we won't solve with what I like to think of, or what I've classified in the past is authenticating things. We need to be thinking about attributes and big data and behavior, and we need to start authenticating people. So I'm going to turn that over because that implies a whole lot relevant to privacy, relevant to legal frameworks, relevant to trust frameworks. So I'm going to turn it over to my colleague Don to finish off this.
Thanks, Pete. This notion of a trust framework, and trust and framework has been discussed all day, and I'll talk a bit more about it in a second. But I really like the meme that Barbara and Scott have introduced of rules and tools. I like it because it kind of maps onto the two roles that I have in the industry. One is, as the executive director of the OpenID Foundation, it is a nonprofit industry standards development organization that creates open standards for the verification, authentication, and use of identity attributes on the web. And that foundation has the usual suspects that Google, Microsoft, PayPal, Yahoo, the major players in identity on its board, and the principal drivers between this team of rivals that requires open standards in order to complete the kind of trusted transaction that Pete was describing. So the technology tool set of open standards is really part of the fabric that informs the systems, both security-oriented and identity, that we've been talking about today. The other identity I have is the founder and chair of an organization called the Open Identity Exchange, which again has not only a team of rivals, but rival sectors. So we have the enterprise players like Microsoft, CA, and others who are concerned with identity from an enterprise perspective and security, as well as the traditional data aggregators and the credit bureaus, the telecommunications companies. And recently, we've been joined by the government of the United Kingdom, which is in the process of deploying a system that will verify the identities in a secure and privacy-protecting way for all of 60 million Britons in the next 2 years. So these two organizations, looking at identity and data and security, are fairly unique in that they are rivals that require some kind of self-regulation at internet scale in order to create the trusted transactions that are the flywheel of the commercial systems that Pete was describing. Let me give you an example that may resonate with some of the earlier presentations. So today there's a work group within the OpenID Foundation of Google, Microsoft, Twitter, LinkedIn, Facebook. Again, companies that are intense rivals, but are trying to fundamentally address the security breaches that are running through the ecosystem. So we have this notion of a shared signals infrastructure where one company can signal to another that there's a new account that's been created on Google using a backup account from Yahoo that's now sending 50,000 emails an hour. So Google knows that or Yahoo knows that it's a spammer, but it doesn't have a protocol, a technical protocol, to send that signal to its competitors in the ecosystem and vice versa. So we need a technical protocol in order to have that neighborhood watch effect at a global scale that Scott talked about. And we need a set of governance, a rule set that will handle the liability and the other considerations for a system like that. So the notion of a trust framework is quite simple. It's really the sum of three parts: the business, the technical, and the legal requirements of a community of interest that's gathered around a security protocol or an identity authentication protocol. So that's the work that the Open Identity Exchange and the Open ID Foundation are doing. And I think it's emblematic of many of the issues that you've all discussed in research, which is how do we create new infrastructure at global scale that will fuel commerce, but also protect not only the data of the people in those systems, but also the corporate data and infrastructure that they must protect. What I'd like to add here is that many of you have been talking about these new security protocols or security challenges. And one of the ambitions that the Open Identity Exchange has is to have a global registry of trust frameworks. So if you think about a framework for trust and transactions as being an instrumentation of trust at global scale, the notion of having a registry that will host in a nonprofit, technology agnostic, global basis these trust frameworks, it will expose those trust frameworks to the scrutiny of the marketplace. It will, for the first time, begin to collect and centralize these agreements, these frameworks, in one place so that we can begin to do a read across and see how security, identity, privacy, liability are managed within these multi-party agreements at internet scale. So that is the work that we, at these two organizations, have carved out. What to me is so exciting about the work that you've been doing is that in this new economy, finding private sector sponsorship for research is challenging. And we now have a vehicle in these organizations where these companies, these teams of rivals, can begin to fund joint research. We have a joint research effort underway around liability in these systems, joint research around the management of governance in these systems. So what we're trying to do is to set up and propagate this trust instrumentation around frameworks that can be registered and be made transparent. And we're trying to create and develop new trust instrumentation so that at a global scale, a company can begin to self-certify their conformance to a given set of standards or to a framework. What does that mean? Well, let me give you an example. So the Microsoft Azure platform has adopted the OpenID Connect standard. It's an open standard around identity verification. What we have done on behalf of Google, Microsoft, Salesforce, PayPal, and others is to give them the opportunity to self-certify their technical conformance, their legal conformance to a technical standard. What does that mean? It means that in this case, Microsoft has said that we are following this technical protocol in this specific way at this time for this specific platform. Azure OpenID Connect. And what Microsoft then does is exposes exactly how it meets that standard for all to see at any time, at no cost for anyone. So that notion of radical transparency and the marriage of a legal self-assertion to a technical conformance, we think can be a new way of instrumenting trust at a global scale. Why is that so powerful, and why is it so important? Well, it turns out that we don't have an enforcement mechanism for global interoperability. We can't call in the blue hats from the United Nations to sanction one company or another, but we can create this neighborhood watch notion that Scott talked about and manifest it in the identity. So again, using Microsoft as an example, it exposes the technical code for how Azure complies with the standard, and then marries that technical result with a legal self-attestation. It says, we, Microsoft, are doing this standard in this specific way for this specific platform. The enforceability or the self-regulation that occurs is that Microsoft is putting on the line its most valued asset, which is its brand. The minute that Microsoft puts up its results, and Google its, and PayPal its results, you can be sure that three things happen. Its competitors crawl through their conformance results with a fine-tooth comb, neighborhood watch. It invites lawsuits, class action lawsuits, if it should make any representation. And it creates a crowdsourced neighborhood watch of developers and others that want to make sure that that self-attestation and that self-certification of technical conformance is true. By doing so, we have used transparency to create trust. By creating the trust, we can fuel the transactions that Pete just discussed. The rules and the tools married together and then exposed in this registry may be a way that we can instrument trust at internet scale that drives identity verification. But the flip side of identity verification is security for the enterprise and the individual in both commercial systems and social networks. So that's a very brief overview of some of the things that are happening. But I think there is a possibility of beginning to marry the work that you've been doing on discrete parts in this ecosystem of trust, ecosystem of internet scale interoperability, so that we can use market forces to create some new vectors of transparency.
So just a couple of comments on that, and then I'm going to ask if folks in the audience, because we're going to be needing to stop at 4, if anybody has any questions in just a second. I just wanted to emphasize a couple of points that came out in both of these presentations. Trust framework sounds like a very mysterious thing, and it really isn't. It's really arrangements, and as Don said, they have the different aspects, the business, legal, technical elements. One of the things that's going on now is the internet is we built a superhighway system. Remember they used to talk about the information superhighway, and we don't have any road signs or traffic rules. So we built the system without the rules. And I was in a UN meeting, and one of the ambassadors from Europe said, the countries are getting less powerful, the companies are getting more powerful, period. He actually used the word period at the end of that. So one of the things that's going on is, what does global governance look like for the internet? And so we're talking about is contracts, right? Because they're trans-jurisdictional. We're not ready for treaties yet and that kind of thing. We still have the nation states there. They're not going away. So one of the things, we talked about AAA risk before, accidents, attacks, and acts of nature. When you start to think about neighborhood watch, what you're talking about is common interest. So it's not just attacks that it takes care of, but if you look at accidents, if you have standards of behavior that are propagated over larger populations, then people know how to act, what kind of duties they have, and they're going to act not negligently. So there'll be fewer accidents, or people will be able to help each other not have accidents. We talked before about Katrina hitting and then FEMA's response. Well, if you have something that you can't prevent, a disaster, a Stuxnet kind of thing, a cyber attack of another sort, then you have that secondary risk. Remember, we were talking about the FEMA response. In Neighborhood Watch, you can respond better to the things you can't. And most obviously, you can have the Neighborhood Watch to watch out for attacks. You can detect things if you know what the standard is. One of the things that's really nice about the strategy here, it doesn't do everything, but what it does is it starts to align commercial interests and individual. One of the big problems we have here is conflict, right? That there's conflict. There's once a quote I saw, somebody said that there's conflicts on Wall Street, and the response was, well, that's where the value is. That's where the money is. One of the challenges here, we have nation states, we have companies, they're all powerful, and individuals are trying to figure out who are the mommies and daddies, right? Who's going to take care of my interests here, right? Where's the mommy and daddy? And part of what's going on is really a restructuring of those sovereignties, right? Of those abilities from people to look for a cure and look for help. So one of the questions I have for our two panelists here is, what are some of the research questions that people might be researchers can go out and start to look at that would be most relevant in the commercial sector, so that they can start to create that communication with academic research and the research that's going on in commercial organizations. Do either?
So I think if we look at the Verify program in the UK, the British government is creating this national verification program by using commercial players. Unlike other countries where the government assigns your identity and gives you that identity card, countries like the US, Canada, the UK, Australia, and New Zealand are looking for some kind of a private sector-led public-private partnership around identity that secures the privacy, makes it easy to use, but also promotes trade and transactions. So I think the user experience is key to that. How can we create a user experience? How can we measure a user experience that provides consent that allows for these transactions to occur, allows for the user to be informed about how his data or data about him is being used in a given system? So I think the pivot point for many of these systems is this notion of informed consent in these highly complex systems. So how consent can be measured from a demographic way, from a other research metrics, is going to be incredibly important. We have radical models. We have a Facebook model of one and done. You sign up for Facebook, and your consent for all of your data, the metadata, your social graph is now the property of Facebook. That may work it does work for over 1 billion people. But how do we look at increasingly complex systems like healthcare, where HIPAA and other regulatory vectors complicated this enormously difficult and wicked problem, which is how do we provide for privacy, security, and ease of use? So that is the principal struggle in this identity ecosystem that Pete described. That is research that only a handful of companies, Google, Microsoft, PayPal, and then it drops, where fundamental research and analysis is lacking in the ecosystem. And that is, I think, an opportunity for the kind of work that was described earlier, fitting into the commercial self-interest that drives these systems.
Yeah, I mean, for me, I try to keep it simple. And a couple of things that I saw today I thought really resonated with me. One was this presentation on virtual machines and how they were or being overactive, and that being an indicator of something not being right. And I love that approach, because you're not telling somebody here's what's wrong. What you're saying is, I think something might be wrong and you should probably go look at it. And when I look at most of what I see in this, I don't spend a lot of time at universities, this MIT and the University of Texas and here, but I could count on one hand. But most of what I see are really, for me, make sure I say it the right way, overcomplicates what we really want to deliver to the marketplace. What we want are platforms that, again, are self-certified. Developers can go in and add something that's relevant right now, today, so that we heard earlier, and this is an absolute truism, that the bad guys work in seconds and minutes, where we work in weeks and days, or days and weeks and sometimes months, right? And it's just, there's no way to win that fight. But there is a way to win that fight if we can put in these platforms, the trust frameworks by which those platforms interact, such that innovators can then, and researchers can solve specific problems, which we don't really have today, right? We have very much a siloed approach to how we look at identity in general, and
And as these frameworks emerge, as signals are begun to be identified as being valuable to trade, for example, the work group that is meeting today, what is the engine that's uniting Facebook, LinkedIn, Google, Microsoft, and other, that self-interest, that if they can create a give-to-get model where they can provide a signal in milliseconds to their competitor, knowing that their competitor has a framework to do the same for them, we increase the security of the neighborhood, and each company increases the security and the value that they provide an individual or enterprise that works within their systems.
Overtime, I apologize. Any questions from the audience?
So there is a market already that exists that's both vibrant and full of life, and my identity is being traded on it right now due to a breach of a telco. I'm not going to mention any names. So if we look at cyber criminals, they have figured this out. There's a value to each identity they trade. Why not go to the CME and start trading it up above the floor rather than in the basement?
Well, the Open Identity Exchange's name might give some indication to where we think that will go. But there was a wonderful presentation earlier about reputation-based systems. And the fascinating thing about the black market is how efficient it is. You have drug dealers, pornographers, and all kinds of bad guys engaging in this vibrant, formerly Silk Road platform, where reputation systems, where it maps almost one-to-one the kinds of self-regulatory systems and trust mechanisms that you see in Amazon. Free deals, reputation, reviews of drug dealers. And it's just remarkable how little friction exists in that terrible market. So I think you're exactly right. We have to learn from the early adopters, the pornographers and others, how to create these exchange systems, but provide the kind of transparency that creates the security, privacy, and ease of use that's required.
So, and this, again, we want to have this be a conversation. This is the beginning of a conversation. So I think, Pete, cards over there, you have the information for both of these gentlemen. Please join me in thanking the panelists here and also for a great discussion. We're hoping to just begin today.